Karen's racist son orders black man to leave his own pool, unaware he's the police chief. On a warm, sunny afternoon in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the atmosphere felt light and relaxed. The air was filled with the sound of laughter and splashes as a group of friends and family gathered around the backyard pool for a weekend party. Everyone was enjoying the beautiful weather, unwinding after a busy week. It was the kind of day where people could forget about their worries and just enjoy life, soaking in the sun and the peaceful surroundings. At the center of this gathering was Karen, a woman in her mid-40s who was well known in the neighborhood. She was the kind of person who liked to be the center of attention, always talking loudly, always making sure her voice was heard. Her son, Kyle, a 25-year-old man, was also part of the crowd. Kyle had grown up in this neighborhood and had inherited his mother's outspoken nature, although his attitude often leaned towards arrogance. He believed in a certain sense of superiority, as if he were above others. His friends often referred to him as the entitled kid, and he wore that label like a badge of honor. As the party went on, the backyard was filled with the smell of barbecue and the sound of upbeat music. Karen and her friends were chatting, having drinks by the poolside, while Kyle was talking to his group of friends near the water, laughing loudly and clearly enjoying himself. It was all very typical for a neighborhood gathering, filled with the kind of cheerful chatter you would expect on a lazy weekend afternoon. But everything changed when Jason Moore walked into the scene. Jason was a man in his early 40s, tall, with a calm and confident demeanor. He was dressed casually in a pair of swim trunks, a t-shirt, and sunglasses, looking like someone just here to enjoy the day like everyone else. He was walking with his wife and 2 children, all heading toward the pool. They had been looking forward to some time in the sun, and Jason was ready to relax. Jason's family had recently moved to the neighborhood, and while he knew that there were different personalities here, he never expected his day to turn into something unexpected. As Jason and his family walked toward the pool, they caught Kyle's attention. From the very moment Kyle laid eyes on Jason, something in him shifted. Maybe it was the way Jason held himself, or perhaps it was the fact that Jason's family was black. Kyle wasn't even aware of why he felt this way, but something inside him made him suspicious. Kyle had grown up in an environment where certain ideas were passed down, ideas that Jason was about to unknowingly challenge. Without fully processing it, Kyle's mind made a snap judgment, fueled by unwarranted biases that he wasn't willing to recognize. Jason and his family approached the pool's edge, and that's when Kyle made his move. He walked over to them, his face showing a mix of confusion and something more. Without hesitation, Kyle spoke up, his voice louder than usual, cutting through the air. He told Jason that he was not allowed in the pool. His tone was sharp, almost demanding. Jason, confused, glanced over at him and tried to understand what was happening. "Excuse me," Jason said, his brow furrowed in confusion. Kyle stood firm, repeating himself with a bit more force. "You need to leave. You're not allowed in the pool." Jason was taken aback. He couldn't understand why Kyle would say something like that. He looked around the pool and saw that no one else was reacting. Was this some kind of misunderstanding? Jason calmly responded, "I'm just here with my family to enjoy the pool." "I'm sure there's some confusion, but we are allowed to be here." Kyle didn't back down, though. His jaw tightened and he raised his voice even more. "I said you're not allowed. It's for residents only, and you're not one of us." Jason's confusion turned into a sense of disbelief. He had just moved into the neighborhood, and he had no idea what Kyle was talking about. Was this really happening? He was caught off guard, but he stayed calm. "I'm not sure where the misunderstanding is coming from, but this is a public pool. I'm a resident here. My family and I live down the street." Kyle shook his head dismissively. "Doesn't matter, you don't belong here." At that moment, Jason realized that this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. Something deeper was at play. The way Kyle was speaking to him, the way he was assuming authority, all pointed to something much more troubling than just a mix-up over pool rules. It wasn't about the pool at all, it was about race. Kyle's prejudice was showing, and it was clear he didn't want a black man in his pool. Karen, who had been sitting by the edge of the pool, overheard the confrontation. At first, she didn't think much of it. She was more focused on her conversation with her friends, the laughter, and the drinks. But as she heard Kyle's voice rise, her attention was drawn to the scene. She stood up slowly and walked over to see what was going on. She glanced between Kyle and Jason, trying to piece together what was happening. Jason, still calm, addressed her directly. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what your son's issue is, but I've lived here long enough to know that this pool is for everyone." Karen, sensing the tension, finally stepped forward. She tried to make sense of the situation but was still taken aback by her son's sudden hostility. She glanced nervously at Jason and then at Kyle. "Kyle, what's going on?" she asked, her voice unsteady. Kyle, not yet willing to let go of his position, responded defiantly, "He doesn't belong here, Mom. You can't let him just walk in like this." Jason, hearing the panic in Karen's voice, tried to reassure her. "I'm just trying to have a peaceful day with my family. There's no need for this to go any further." But Kyle wasn't having it. He stepped even closer to Jason, his eyes full of judgment and arrogance. "You're not welcome here," he repeated. It was clear now that Kyle wasn't going to back down easily. He was so caught up in his own beliefs that he couldn't see how wrong he was. The tension was growing, and Jason knew that if he didn't address this now, the situation could get much worse. Karen looked around at the other guests who were watching. Some were awkwardly standing by, unsure of how to get involved, while others were beginning to feel uncomfortable. The once peaceful gathering had taken an unexpected turn. Jason took a deep breath and, trying to keep his composure, made a decision. He needed to stop this right then and there before things escalated further. "I think it's time I explain who I am," Jason said calmly, letting the words hang in the air. His voice was steady but firm, and it seemed to capture everyone's attention. The atmosphere around the pool had shifted. What was once a lively gathering filled with laughter and relaxation had turned into something uncomfortable. Karen stood by, still unsure of how to handle the situation. She had heard her son, Kyle, shouting at the man, Jason, demanding that he leave. The confusion in Karen's mind was growing. She hadn't expected something like this to happen at her party. It had all started so innocently. Jason's calm voice cut through the tension. "I think it's time I explain who I am," he said, looking directly at Kyle, who was standing firm with his arms crossed, not willing to back down. Jason's words caught everyone off guard. The guests by the pool stopped what they were doing, sensing that something serious was unfolding. The light-hearted energy that had once filled the space was now replaced by the weight of curiosity and concern. Karen looked at her son, unsure of what was about to happen. She hadn't expected Jason to respond this way. She had been so caught up in her own thoughts about the situation that she hadn't noticed how much it had escalated. Jason stood tall and confident, a stark contrast to Kyle's defiant stance. He wasn't just a man standing at the pool's edge. He was something more, and it was clear that Karen needed to understand who he was before this situation spiraled further out of control. Kyle looked at Jason, confused. "What are you talking about?" Kyle's voice was still filled with arrogance. He wasn't ready to admit that he might be wrong, and he certainly wasn't ready to accept that Jason might be someone of importance. He stood his ground, still convinced that the man in front of him had no business being there. Jason took a slow step forward, making sure his movements were deliberate. He wasn't interested in fighting or escalating things, but he knew he had to put an end to Kyle's behavior. "I am Officer Jason Moore," Jason began. "I am the police chief of this town." The words hit Kyle like a sudden wave. It was as if the ground beneath him had shifted. He blinked in surprise, his posture faltering for a moment. Karen, who had been quiet up until now, looked at Jason with wide eyes. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "The police chief," she repeated, her voice a mix of surprise and disbelief. "Yes," Jason nodded, keeping his voice calm. "I've been serving this community for a long time, and I'm proud of the work I do. But more importantly, I believe in fairness and equality. What your son has done here is wrong." Kyle's face turned red, but his pride didn't allow him to back down. He scoffed, trying to brush off Jason's words. "So what? Just because you're the police chief doesn't mean you can do whatever you want." Jason's eyes remained steady. "I'm not here to make trouble. I'm here to enjoy my day with my family. But what I will not stand for is discrimination. No one should be treated like this, especially not in a public space." The words hung in the air, and for a moment there was silence. Kyle's face showed the mix of confusion and frustration, but he didn't know how to respond. The realization that he had just made a huge mistake was starting to sink in, but his pride kept him from apologizing. Instead, he looked around at the other guests, trying to find someone who would back him up. But no one spoke. The partygoers stood by in awkward silence, unsure of what to do next. It was clear that Kyle had crossed a line, but no one wanted to get involved. Jason could see the tension in the air, but he wasn't going to let Kyle's stubbornness derail the situation any further. He turned toward Karen, who had been watching everything unfold. "Ma'am, I don't want to make things more difficult for you, but your son needs to understand that what he's doing isn't acceptable." Karen's gaze shifted between Kyle and Jason. The weight of the situation was beginning to settle on her shoulders. She had always prided herself on being a good mother, but now she was realizing that she had let her son develop some harmful views without ever stepping in to correct them. She could see the shame creeping into Kyle's eyes, but he wasn't ready to admit it yet. Karen felt a pang of guilt, but she knew this was the moment for her to act. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, standing between her son and Jason. Her voice was softer now, filled with an edge of concern. "Kyle, enough," she said firmly. "This is not how we treat people. I'm ashamed of you right now." Kyle shot her a look of surprise, his jaw tightening in frustration. "Mom, don't." "No," Karen interrupted, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You've crossed a line. This man, Jason, is not just anyone. He's a leader in our community and you've disrespected him. You've hurt him and embarrassed yourself." Kyle's face flushed with anger, but deep down, he knew his mother was right. His pride wouldn't allow him to admit it openly, but in that moment he realized the mistake he had made. The words stung, but he refused to apologize. Karen turned back to Jason, her voice now softer and more apologetic. "I am so sorry for what he's done. This isn't who we are, and I promise this won't happen again." Jason nodded, his expression calm but firm. "I appreciate you saying that. But it's important that Kyle learns from this. Racism, discrimination, these things don't belong in any part of our lives." Karen nodded in agreement, her mind racing with the weight of everything happening. She had always tried to be a good mother, but now she realized that she had to do more. She needed to talk to Kyle about the harm caused by his words, about the beliefs he had been raised with, and how they had shaped his views. It wasn't enough to just apologize. It was time for change. The guests around the pool slowly began to murmur among themselves, breaking the silence that had fallen over the area. Some nodded in agreement with Jason, while others seemed uncomfortable, unsure of how to proceed. But one thing was clear. The incident had caught everyone's attention, and it wasn't something they could just brush aside. Jason, sensing that the situation had calmed, gave Karen a reassuring look. "I'm not angry. I'm not even upset. But it's important that we all learn from this. We can't let things like this slide." Karen nodded again, her thoughts focused on what she needed to do next. She turned back to Kyle, her voice now softer but more serious. "Kyle, we're going to talk about this. And we're going to fix it. But for now, I want you to think about what you've done." Kyle didn't respond, but his gaze dropped to the ground, his shoulders slumped in a rare moment of reflection. Jason didn't say anything more. He simply turned and walked back to his family, his presence still calm but firm. As the situation began to settle, Karen's mind was filled with a new sense of urgency. She realized that this moment, this uncomfortable, painful moment, was an opportunity for growth, for her son, for herself, for their family. She had to take responsibility as a mother and as a person for the beliefs that had shaped her family's world. The awkward silence that followed Jason's departure from the pool area lingered in the air. Kyle stood there, still processing what had just happened. He couldn't believe what he had just done. He had been caught off guard by Jason's calm demeanor and the way Karen had stepped in to support him. The pride he had held onto for so long suddenly seemed fragile, like a thin layer of ice on a lake. It was beginning to crack beneath him. Karen stood quietly by the edge of the pool, her eyes downcast, unsure of how to proceed. She felt conflicted. Part of her wanted to apologize right there for Kyle's behavior, but another part of her knew that apologizing wouldn't be enough. She needed to teach him something more than just saying the words, "I'm sorry." It was time for her to step up and show him the reality of his actions, the consequences of his words. Kyle finally broke the silence, his voice low and defensive. "Mom, I didn't mean it like that," he muttered, clearly uncomfortable. "You know I was just trying to keep things in order around here." Karen turned toward him, her face softening but also filled with concern. "Kyle, it's not about keeping order. What you did wasn't about rules. You hurt someone for no reason other than the color of his skin." Kyle opened his mouth to respond, but Karen raised a hand to stop him. Just listen to me for a moment, she said gently. She could feel the weight of the moment, the gravity of what was happening between them. This wasn't just about Jason or the pool. It was about her son, his growth, and her own role in shaping his future. You've been raised to believe certain things about people, but those things aren't true, Karen continued. I've always tried to teach you right from wrong, but sometimes we don't realize that we've been taught wrong things ourselves. This is one of those times. You don't get to decide who belongs and who doesn't based on the color of their skin, Kyle. You just don't. Kyle's face flushed with frustration, but this time, Karen noticed something different in his expression. It wasn't just anger, it was confusion, the kind of confusion that only came when someone was forced to face a truth they weren't ready to accept. His hands were clenched at his sides, but his posture had softened slightly, as if he was starting to realize the enormity of what he had done. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I know you didn't, but the problem is that you didn't think about it before you acted, Karen replied. That's the issue. We all have these biases, and we don't always recognize them until we're faced with something like this. Kyle looked away, his gaze drifting toward the pool, but he didn't say anything more. It was clear that the weight of what had happened was beginning to sink in. He had never really thought about racism in any meaningful way. His upbringing, the people he had spent time with, and the environment he had grown up in had all shaped the way he viewed the world. But now, he was confronted with something that was impossible to ignore. Karen watched her son struggle with the realization. It was painful to see him in this state, but she knew that this was a crucial moment for both of them. She could have easily let it go, brushed it off, and carried on as though nothing had happened. But that wouldn't teach Kyle anything. Instead, she chose to be the mother he needed in this moment, the mother who would help him understand what was wrong and guide him toward becoming a better person. I'm not perfect, Kyle, Karen said, her voice filled with honesty. I've made mistakes in the past, too. I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad, but because it's important. We can't just ignore the things that happen around us. We can't turn a blind eye to injustice, especially when it's right in front of us. Kyle shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing as he considered his mother's words. But what do I do now? He asked, his voice quiet and unsure. Karen stepped closer to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. You need to learn from this. You need to understand why what you did was wrong and how it affected Jason, and you need to think about what you can do to make things right. Kyle let out a deep sigh, his shoulders slumping slightly. I don't know where to even start, he admitted. Karen smiled softly, though it was a sad smile. Start by talking to Jason, apologize for what you did, and then take some time to think about what you believe and why. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but it's a start. Kyle nodded slowly, his face still conflicted. I'll do it, I'll talk to him. Karen gave him a reassuring smile. I know you will, but don't just apologize because I told you to. Apologize because you understand why it matters. The air felt different now, like a shift had occurred in both of them. Kyle still had a long way to go, but at least now he was beginning to see things in a new light. Karen had always known that motherhood was about more than just providing food and shelter. It was about teaching her children the values that would guide them through life. And this moment, though difficult, was one of those important lessons. It was a lesson in empathy, humility, and the importance of recognizing one's own mistakes. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard, Karen and Kyle stood there in silence for a few moments. There was a lot to think about, a lot to process, but at least now they were starting down a new path. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but it was a beginning. In the distance, Karen could hear the sounds of Jason and his family gathering their things, preparing to leave. She knew it was time to approach him. Kyle had to do his part, but she, too, had to face the reality of the situation and make amends. Karen took a deep breath and started walking toward Jason, her heart heavy but determined. Jason had already made his way toward the gate, but as Karen approached, he paused and turned to face her. I'm sorry about what happened, Karen said, her voice steady but filled with regret. My son, he didn't mean to cause any harm, but I know what he did was wrong. Jason gave her a nod, his expression calm but understanding. It's not about what he meant, it's about what he did, but I appreciate your apology. It's a start. Karen nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. She could see the sincerity in Jason's eyes, and she knew that despite everything, they had come to a place of understanding. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. But it was a good start. The days following the incident by the pool were heavy with a mix of emotions for Karen and Kyle. The confrontation with Jason had left a mark on both of them, and while Kyle had promised to apologize, Karen couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. This wasn't just about saying sorry, it was about a fundamental shift in understanding in how her son viewed the world. Kyle had always been a good kid, at least in her eyes. He had made mistakes, sure, but hadn't we all? But this was different. What he had done went deeper than just a careless comment or a thoughtless action. It was rooted in something bigger, something that needed to be addressed with more than just a quick fix. Kyle had spent the last few days avoiding eye contact with his mother. He had retreated into his room after their conversation, and when he wasn't there, he was out with his friends, avoiding any deep discussions. Karen knew this was his way of processing the situation. He was ashamed, but not ready to fully confront what had happened. She tried not to push him too hard, but she also couldn't ignore the fact that he needed to take responsibility for his actions. One evening, a few days after the incident, Karen found herself sitting in the living room, staring out the window. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow across the neighborhood, but it didn't bring her the comfort it usually did. She was restless, her mind racing with thoughts of her son, the pool incident, and the bigger issues that were now on the table. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through her fingers. This wasn't just about the pool anymore. It was about raising her son to understand the consequences of his words, his actions, and the need for empathy in a world that wasn't always fair. As Karen sat there lost in thought, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around to find Kyle standing in the doorway, his expression hesitant, his hands shoved in his pockets. It was the first time in days that he had come out of his shell. Karen's heart softened. She could see that he was struggling, but at least he was trying. "Kyle," she said softly, her voice warm but serious. "You okay?" He looked at her for a moment, not saying anything. Then in a low voice he muttered, "I've been thinking about what happened." A lot, he paused, and Karen could hear the weight of his words. I don't get it, Mom. I don't get how I could have been so wrong." Karen stood up, her heart aching for him. She walked over to him and placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a reassuring squeeze. "You're not the only one who has to learn, Kyle. I've made my mistakes too. But what's important now is that we understand what went wrong and what we can do to fix it." Kyle looked at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "But I didn't even realize I was doing anything wrong," he said quietly. "I was just acting how I've always seen things, the way I've been taught. I didn't think about how it would affect anyone else." Karen nodded slowly, understanding the depth of what he was saying. "I know. And that's the problem, Kyle. We all have biases. Sometimes we don't even realize they're there until we do something that makes us stop and think. But it's what we do next that matters." Kyle's gaze dropped to the floor, his face contorted in confusion and regret. "I feel so stupid. I didn't even realize that I was treating someone like that. It makes me feel awful, like I'm a person I don't even want to be." Karen took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "The important thing is that you recognize it. You can't change what you did, but you can change how you act moving forward. You've got to think about the impact your actions have on others, especially people who might not have the same privileges you do." Kyle nodded slowly, processing his mother's words. He looked up at her again, this time with a sense of determination in his eyes. "I want to make things right. I need to apologize to Jason, but I don't know if I can just say I'm sorry and expect it to be okay." Karen smiled, proud of her son for his willingness to make amends. "Apologizing is the first step, Kyle, but it's not just about saying the words. It's about showing him that you understand what you did wrong. It's about showing him that you're committed to doing better." Kyle's expression softened, his shoulders relaxing as he let out a deep sigh. "I know, Mom. I want to be better. I just don't know where to start." Karen thought for a moment, feeling the weight of the conversation. She knew that Kyle needed to face Jason, but she also knew that this would be a hard conversation for both of them. "Start by talking to him, Kyle. Don't make excuses, just say what's in your heart. Acknowledge the harm you caused and show him that you want to learn from it." Kyle nodded, a sense of resolve settling over him. "I'll do it. I'll talk to him." The next day, Kyle finally worked up the courage to go over to Jason's house. His nerves were on edge as he stood in front of the door, wondering how Jason would react. Would he accept the apology? Would he understand that Kyle was trying to be better? It felt like a big step, and he wasn't sure if he was ready. But he had to do it. When Jason answered the door, he looked surprised to see Kyle standing there, but he didn't say anything. Kyle cleared his throat, feeling his palms sweat, but he knew this was the moment he had to face. He took a deep breath. "Jason," he started, his voice shaking slightly, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. What I did, it was wrong. I treated you unfairly, and I was disrespectful. I didn't understand how harmful my words were, and I didn't realize the impact they had. I was wrong, and I want to do better." Jason looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Kyle could feel the tension in the air, and for a moment he wasn't sure if Jason would accept his apology. But then, slowly, Jason nodded. "I appreciate you saying that, Kyle," Jason said, his voice calm but firm. "It's not easy to admit when we've made a mistake. But it's the first step toward growth. I'm glad you're trying to learn from this." Kyle let out a sigh of relief, his shoulders finally relaxing. "Thank you, Jason. I won't let this happen again." Jason gave him a small, encouraging smile. "I believe you." As Kyle left Jason's house, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He knew that the journey wasn't over, but this was a crucial first step. He had taken responsibility for his actions, apologized for the hurt he caused, and committed to changing. It wasn't going to be an easy road, but Kyle felt hopeful that he was on the right path. In the weeks that followed Kyle's conversation with Jason, things started to shift, both in the family and in the way Kyle viewed the world. He spent more time reflecting on the day by the pool, not just the confrontation itself, but the moments after, when he truly began to understand the impact of his actions. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't something that happened overnight, but the seeds of change had been planted. He found himself having moments of deep thought, questioning things he had never questioned before. He began to read more, talk to others, and listen in ways he hadn't before. Karen, for her part, noticed the change in her son. She had always believed in him, but now, more than ever, she saw the potential for him to become someone who could help bring about real change. She had been worried about how things would go, whether he would simply dismiss the incident and move on without learning anything from it. But Kyle was different now. He was trying, really trying to understand the bigger picture. She had also been doing her own work. She took the time to educate herself more deeply, to understand the history of racial prejudice, and how these ingrained biases could affect even the most well-intentioned people. She attended a few workshops on racial justice and even reached out to Jason, wanting to learn from him, asking him questions about his experiences. Karen knew that this was something that needed to be addressed continuously, both with herself and with Kyle. One day, about a month after the pool incident, Karen and Kyle were sitting at the kitchen table, having lunch together. It was a rare, quiet moment between them, and Karen seized the opportunity to check in with him. She had noticed that he had been quieter than usual, though in a way that seemed more thoughtful than distant. "Hey, Kyle," she started, taking a bite of her sandwich. "I've noticed you've been pretty reflective lately. How are you feeling about everything?" Kyle set his sandwich down, wiping his hands on a napkin as he looked up at his mother. "I've been thinking about what I've learned, Mom," he said slowly, his voice quieter than usual. "I don't know if I can ever fully understand everything, but I'm trying." "I know I have a lot of work to do." Karen nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "It's not about being perfect, Kyle. It's about trying every day to be better, to do better. And you've already taken some big steps. You've apologized, you've listened, and you've learned. That's what matters." Kyle gave a small smile, a bit unsure of himself, but genuinely appreciative. "It's harder than I thought. The more I learn, the more I realize how much I didn't know, how much I was blind to. Like when I see people posting things online, I can't just ignore it anymore. I see things differently now." Karen leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "It's good that you're seeing it, Kyle. It's easy to ignore what doesn't directly affect you. But now you're paying attention, and that makes all the difference." They sat there for a moment in silence, both of them processing the weight of the conversation. It wasn't just a passing talk. It was a deeper shift in their relationship and in the way they viewed the world. A week later, Jason invited Karen and Kyle over for dinner. It wasn't the first time they had spoken since the pool incident, but this was the first time they would sit down together, outside of that tense confrontation, to have an honest conversation as equals. Karen wasn't sure what to expect, but she was hopeful. Kyle had agreed to come, although she knew it would be a challenge for him. It was one thing to apologize, It was another to sit down with the person you wronged and have a real conversation about race, privilege, and bias. When they arrived at Jason's house, they were greeted with warm smiles. Jason's wife, Maria, had prepared a meal for them, and the atmosphere was relaxed, friendly, and open. Kyle, who had been nervous about the whole thing, felt a bit more at ease seeing the relaxed environment. He could tell that Jason and Maria were both genuine, and their kindness made him feel more comfortable. The dinner started with small talk, the kind that you'd expect when meeting someone for the first time in a more personal setting. But as the meal went on, the conversation shifted. Jason had asked Kyle about his thoughts since the pool incident, and Karen had spoken about her own journey of self-reflection. The conversation wasn't about assigning blame anymore, it was about understanding and growing together. Jason leaned in, his expression thoughtful. Kyle, I want you to know that I see the effort you've been making. It's not easy to recognize our own biases, let alone face them head-on, but that's what you're doing and I respect that. Kyle nodded, the words from Jason sinking in. He still felt some shame for what had happened, but the way Jason was talking to him, the way he was offering understanding instead of judgment, made him feel like maybe, just maybe, there was hope for change. I don't want to be that person anymore, Kyle said, his voice low but filled with sincerity. I've been thinking a lot about the things I used to believe, and I can see now how wrong I was. It's hard to unlearn everything, but I'm trying. Maria, who had been quietly listening, smiled at Kyle. It's not an easy journey, but you're on the right path, she said gently. The fact that you're here, that you're talking about this, is a huge step. Karen glanced over at Kyle, her heart full of emotion. She knew that this wasn't the end of the road, but it was a turning point. For both of them. It was a reminder that growth wasn't instant. It was a process, a journey, one that took time, humility, and a willingness to change. As the evening wore on, the conversation became more fluid. They talked about race, about their experiences, and about how much work there still was to do. Kyle listened intently, occasionally adding his own thoughts, but mostly absorbing what was being said. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was truly understanding something bigger than himself. By the end of the evening, Karen and Kyle had made a promise to each other. They would continue to educate themselves, to keep having these difficult but important conversations, and to be a source of support for each other as they both learned and grew. They knew it wouldn't always be easy, but they also knew that this was the only way forward. As they left Jason's house, Kyle seemed more at ease than he had in a long time. He still had work to do, but for the first time he didn't feel weighed down by guilt or shame. He felt like he was on the path to becoming a better version of himself. It wasn't a quick fix, but it was progress, and progress was enough for now. Several months had passed since the incident at the pool, and a lot had changed for both Kyle and Karen. The weight of that one moment of recklessness had sparked something inside both of them, a realization that couldn't be ignored. While things were better now, they knew that the work wasn't finished. Kyle was no longer the same person he had been before that day. And Karen, too, had transformed. She was more aware, more open, and more dedicated to creating a better environment not just for herself, but for her family. Kyle had begun to speak out more, especially when he saw things that made him uncomfortable, things that reminded him of the biases he had once held. He felt a quiet but firm sense of responsibility now, a responsibility to act, to stand up, and to make sure that the things he had done in the past didn't happen again. He was actively working to unlearn harmful patterns and replace them with new beliefs grounded in empathy and equality. One evening, Karen was sitting in the living room, sipping on a cup of tea, when Kyle walked in. She could tell something had been weighing on him. His usual relaxed demeanor was replaced by a thoughtful look. He sat down next to her, his posture a little stiff, and let out a deep sigh. "Mom, I've been thinking," Kyle said slowly. "I think I've made a real change. I've been a lot more aware of my actions and my words, but I'm not sure if it's enough." Karen raised an eyebrow, intrigued by his words. "What do you mean? I think you've come a long way, Kyle. You've worked hard to understand what happened." "But what do you think is still missing?" Kyle paused for a moment, as though carefully choosing his words. "It's not just about understanding, though. It's about how I can be part of the change, you know. I've learned that it's not enough to just keep my mouth shut when I see something wrong happening. I need to actually do something about it." Karen smiled softly, her heart swelling with pride. "That's exactly it. Being aware is just the first step." But it's the actions you take next that truly matter. You've grown so much, Kyle, I can see it. Kyle's face softened. I've started to call people out when they make insensitive jokes or comments. It's not always easy, and it's definitely awkward sometimes, but I know it's the right thing to do. I don't want to be silent anymore. I want to be a part of the solution. Karen placed her hand on his. I'm so proud of you, Kyle. You've come a long way, and I can see you're really committed to making a difference. Keep going, keep standing up for what's right. Kyle nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of determination and uncertainty. I just don't want to mess up again, you know. I don't want to go back to the way I was. Karen squeezed his hand gently. You won't. This is a journey, Kyle. It's not about being perfect. It's about staying committed to growth. You've already proven you can change. And you've proven that you're not afraid to look at yourself and see where you need to improve. Kyle leaned back in his chair, his thoughts heavy with everything that had unfolded. It was true. He had come a long way, but there was still so much more to learn. Still, he felt hopeful. The journey wasn't easy, but it was one he was ready to continue. He understood now that change wasn't something that happened once and was done. It was ongoing. It was in every action, every conversation, and every choice he made moving forward. A few weeks later, Jason invited them over again. This time, it wasn't about confronting a problem or having a difficult conversation. It was about continuing to build a relationship, a friendship. The first time they had sat down together had been tense, awkward, and filled with uncertainty. But now, Kyle felt more at ease. He had apologized, he had learned, and he had taken steps to make things right. He was no longer the same person who had shown up at Jason's door months ago. He was different now, stronger, and more aware. When they arrived at Jason's house, Kyle felt a sense of peace wash over him. Jason greeted them with a warm handshake, and Maria welcomed them inside with a smile. The dinner was casual, just a simple gathering between neighbors and friends. But to Kyle, it felt like something more. It felt like a celebration of everything he had learned and how far he had come. As they sat down to eat, the conversation was light and easy. Kyle found himself laughing and joking along with everyone else. It was clear to him now that the change wasn't just in the words he spoke, but in the way he carried himself. He was no longer ashamed of the work he had to do. Instead, he embraced it. He was open, receptive, and ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. As the evening wore on, Jason turned to Kyle, a thoughtful look on his face. I've been watching you, Kyle, he said with a smile. I can tell you're making real progress. It's not just about what you've learned, but about how you're living it. You're walking the walk, not just talking the talk. Kyle felt a sense of pride stir in his chest. I'm trying, Jason. I really am. I know I can't change everything overnight, but I've committed to doing better. Jason gave him an encouraging nod. And that's all anyone can ask for. Just keep doing what you're doing. It's people like you who can make the difference. Karen, who had been quietly listening, couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. Watching her son interact with Jason and Maria, seeing him comfortable and confident in a way he hadn't been before, it was a moment she would always remember. She realized that despite everything, the discomfort, the tension, and the mistakes, it had all led them to this moment of growth and understanding, and she was proud of them both. As the evening came to a close, Kyle and Karen left Jason's house, the sound of laughter still echoing in their ears. For the first time in a long while, Kyle felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. He wasn't perfect, none of them were, but he was on the right path. It wasn't about getting it all right every time. It was about trying, about being willing to learn, and about taking responsibility for one's actions. That night, as they drove home, Karen turned to Kyle, a smile on her face. I'm proud of you, Kyle. You've come so far. Kyle smiled back, his eyes brighter than they had been in months. Thanks, Mom. I'm proud of me, too. And in that moment, Karen knew that they had both learned a valuable lesson. Change was possible. It wasn't easy and it wasn't instant, but it was always worth the effort.